Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos. Obrigado pela presença. Mais um Tiaços, né? Caminhando agora para o segundo semestre. E hoje nós teremos um convidado muito especial, uma pessoa que há muito tempo eu gostaria que estivesse aqui, Benjamin Sells. Prazer, Benjamin, te conhecer. Grande prazer.
E acabou de me fofocar nos bastidores que você se
Thank you
conhece
very
há
much.
25 anos.
É verdade, é verdade. Vou chegar nisso, vou chegar nisso. Vou fazer primeiro a apresentação formal do Benjamin, por favor. Benjamin Sells é psicoterapeuta, advogado e ex-prefeito de Riverside, Illinois. Ele também é capitão de vela e proprietário da escola de vela mais antiga de Chicago. Escreveu 9 livros, incluindo The Soul of the Law, né, A Alma da Lei, um dos mais importantes livros sobre equilíbrio entre vida pessoal e profissional na história da profissão jurídica, que foi recentemente relançado em uma edição especial de 20 anos. Seu último livro se intitula Beauty Matters, Civic Lessons from an Olmsted Village. Por muitos anos, Benjamin escreveu uma coluna amplamente elogiada sobre questões psicológicas na profissão jurídica e publicou muitos artigos e ensaios sobre psicologia, história e assuntos culturais. Sua colaboração com o famoso psicólogo James Hillman, na obra América, A Conversation with James Hillman and Benjamin Sells, foi premiada com a gradiva Award da National Association for the Advancement for Psychoanalysis. Sells proferiu diversas palestras nos Estados Unidos e no exterior e é um convidado recorrente da prestigiada Eranos Roundtable em Ascona, na Suíça. Mora em Riverside, Illinois. Benjamin Sells tem vários livros, né? Eu vou começar por esse aqui, Working with Images. Benjamin, essa minha edição é do ano de 2000, tem 23 anos, né? Que é um livro onde o Benjamin funcionou como um editor, né, de artigos clássicos da psicologia arquetípica. Ele acabou de lançar Retorno da Beleza, Restaurando a Ecologia da Imaginação, uma linda capa. Se eu não me engano, acho que é uma capa da Margot McLean, né, Benjamin? E ele também lançou The Beauty Matters, Lições Cívicas from a Village. Há um terceiro livro que eu acho que são questões de estilo, né, Benjamin? Eu acho que, não sei se o título é exatamente esse, mas, enfim. Eu conheço o Benjamin há muitos anos, não sei se 25 anos, Benjamin. Eu me lembro da Green Street, pode ser isso? Green Street? Um grupo de pessoas ligadas a Rio há muitos anos atrás, um site que havia, e desde lá eu te acompanho, teus textos, teus livros. Então, para mim, agora é uma grande honra te receber no nosso grupo brasileiro, no Teatro, para você falar de questões que nós estamos aqui envolvidos também há anos, como a questão da beleza, cidadania, urbanismo, e pensar como é que essas questões tão bem trabalhadas pelo Hillman e agora por você podem nos ajudar a compreender o nosso mundo contemporâneo. Obrigado pela tua vinda, é um prazer te receber. A palavra é sua, Benjamin.
Thank you, Marcus, and hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. I was much older than Marcus then, and I'm much older than Marcus now. So, but it has been a long time. So my main themes today, cosmos and city, sound vast, but I hope to show that cosmos and city are both places of close belonging, imaginings of great particularity, that have been inflated by our modern ideas that seem almost always to become high-flown and out of touch. The cosmos and city that I imagine belong first to beauty and are always within the reach of our outstretched arms. They are not abstract ideals, but rather are places of habitation, of neighboring, and of camaraderie. I place cosmos and city together because they belong together. Even though we often think of cosmos as immeasurable space, while the city is firmly grounded in concrete foundations, divided by streets and measured in blocks. I will offer a different view. The stars I think about, said the artist Willem de Kooning, if I could fly, I could reach in a few old-fashioned days. If I stretch my arms next to the rest of myself and wonder where my fingers are, that is all the space I need as a painter. Another source of pleasure for me today is to recall the central role that beauty plays in the works of my friend and mentor, the late James Hillman. Throughout his life and work, Hillman tried to move not only psychology, but our modern estranged minds toward a return to beauty. He saw more clearly than any other writer that I know that as humans, we are by nature aesthetic animals. We exist to appreciate beauty, to create beauty, and to be beautiful. That is all the world asks of us, and nothing more is required. Hillman was relentless in his defense of the autonomy of the psyche and the reality of images. He followed Jung in emphasizing that psyche is image and reminded us that it is Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of beauty, that makes all things, including the gods, available to our aesthetic sensibilities. He knew that without beauty, the sensate, sensuous, sensible cosmos dissolves into atomistic particles, without form, lacking in arrangement and composition. Without the ordering power of beauty, the cosmos loses its allure and vitality and is no longer interesting and enticing, but rather it is left dull and dumb, unworthy of care and attention, much less love. And so it was a vital concern for Hillman to oppose what he viewed as the repression of beauty in our time. Of all psychology's sins, he wrote in his remarkable book, The Soul's Code, the most mortal is its neglect of beauty. Please note that the sin is a mortal sin. It is a sin of hubris that elevates the human over the divine. The ancient gods did not ask for belief or obedience. They required no pledges of allegiance, and they could not be confined by ideology or limited by test of purity. They asked only to be remembered. And our sin, the modern mortal sin, is our neglect of the gods that are in all things. The repression of beauty shows nowhere more than in our deadened aesthetic sensibilities, our anesthetized lives that obsess over the quest for meaning and thereby miss the fullness of what beauty offers without need of meaning. The sense, textures, sounds, visions, taste, fantasies, dreams, inspirations, feelings, emotions, memories, and reflections. All of these and more constitute a well-lived life with no need whatsoever for meaning. The richness of life, its visceral muscularity, and its pulsing animal presence belongs first to beauty, as it is revealed as an image among other images in an ecology of imagination. My work attempts to place beauty as first among equals. Each god presents a perspective, a style of imagining the cosmos that is at once complete in itself, while also serving the greater pantheon. So while today I serve in the temple of beauty, I do so to bring all of the gods into view and remembrance. It is through beauty that we learn of love's greatest desire, its longing for soul. And it is this holy trinity of beauty, love, and soul that places us within an ensouled cosmos, an anima mundi, which is another idea that we can thank Hillman for resurrecting in our time. And so our work here today is personal only in the sense that it is cosmological. By following Hillman and trying to return to beauty, we emphasize that our aesthetic responses, and these are his words, are signs that we are here and taking part in the entire world order, which is from the beginning set out as a pleasing aesthetic display. The ancient Greek word cosmos was for the Greeks an aesthetic term that meant fitting order. It was also, and this is important, an ethical term, meaning good order, good behavior, decency. Other meanings included becomingly, duly, decently, form, fashion, ornament, decoration, embellishment, and dress. Cosmos was also descriptive of sweet songs and ways of speech. The verb cosmos meant to arrange, adorn, furnish. Cosmos was also used to describe governmental order and could refer to a ruler or a magistrate. Thus, cosmos connotes both aesthetic and ethical order, both adornment and decency. Now, notably, none of these meanings have the all-encompassing meaning of the English word world. Indeed, the word cosmos did not mean world for the early Greeks, but rather referred to the general arrangement of things. The particularity inherent in the early Greek usage of cosmos can be contrasted with the later Roman translation of cosmos into universum, meaning the whole world turning around one, unos verta. This step from the particular to the all-encompassing is exactly the step that we do not want to take. Universe evokes grand theories of everything, big bangs, infinite space, and limitless time. The mundane, the particular, and the simple facts of things are not good enough to keep company with such ever-expanding concepts. In the universal realm, particulars become parts whose significance matters only in terms of relationships and interactions that purportedly constitute the whole. Only the whole can constitute meaning, completeness, and coherence. Things in themselves are insufficient because from a universal perspective, parts cannot be wholes, meaning cannot be inherently intelligible, and completeness cannot exist in the apparent manifest form of things. The expansive corruption of cosmos into universe reappears in the English word cosmology, where particular things, the richness given to the senses by the adornments and ornamentations of the cosmos, are replaced with an abstract concept and are turned into, and these are Hillman's words, a vast gas bag, outer, empty, spacey, and cold, while the logos of the cosmos is without sweet song. What is important to remember is that cosmos precedes and does not rely on logos. The many things of the cosmos exist quite apart from what we have to say about them. Rather, cosmos arises within a polytheistic context where things are revealed through their individual presentations, among other things. Their apparent animate natures are given with and by their form, as the great Swiss zoologist Adolf Portman told us, and are directly perceived as images. Cosmos is not a projection. Universe is. The important idea here is that cosmos is not an abstraction. It is not amorphous, but is perceived in and through particular images. Each thing is a cosmos, fittingly ordered, becoming, and contained, not a universe, but a unity. Particulars are not made coherent by an overarching theory applied to them, but by the fitting order that is given with each thing in its precise manifestation as an image. Every image is inherently intelligible, a cosmos unto itself that is sensate, sensuous, and sensible, and specifically placed among other images, arranged as a bouquet or a concerto is arranged, held together in mythic configurations. Cosmos, says Hillman, does not present itself as an all-embracing whole, but as the appearance of fittingness of each thing as and where it is, how well, how decorously, how appropriately it displays, and its beauty is that very display, cosmos in each, as each grain of sand. If cosmos is revealed by beauty in the display of each thing, then the unmediated experience of cosmos is aesthetic. The English word cosmetics, with its aesthetic relation to adornment and ornamentation, shading and blushing and coloration, especially of the face and eyes, is much closer to the early Greek meaning of cosmos than are the grand theories of cosmology. Aesthetic also comes to us from the Greek. Aesthesis comes from words meaning to perceive, and that have root meanings of taking in, breathing in, gasp, and struggle for breath. Although modern translators equate aesthesis with sense perception, that meaning, says Hillman, cannot be understood without taking into account the Greek goddess of the senses, Aphrodite, or the organ of Greek sensation, the heart, and the root of that word, that sniffing, gasping, breathing in of the world. Hillman, the aesthetic imagination is the primary mode of knowing the cosmos. The aesthetic imagination is the primary mode of knowing the cosmos. This root meaning of aesthetics suggests an embodied appreciation of things, the instinctive that we experience when we encounter a wild animal in the woods or turn the corner in a gallery and are stopped in our tracks by a painting. For that instant, beauty arrests us. We gasp, and beauty, as we say, takes our breath away. But there's another breathing too, a breathing in that comes with intimacy, that is indicative of place and that abides in memory. The grassy smell of a spring rain, the salty brine of the seashore, the familiar fragrance of a lover's hair. Think how we stop and linger to breathe them in, taking them into our lungs, into our chests, into our hearts. Anayans reminds us that in the Upanishads, speech, sight, hearing, and mind were known as breaths, prana. Does this perhaps suggest that all of the various ways by which we perceive beauty end up affecting us close to the heart, that organ that for many cultures is the place of knowing and the generating source of eros? If the beauty of cosmos gives rise to eros, and we should remember here that according to myth, eros was either the child of Aphrodite or came into existence with her as her consort and guide, then this is where cosmos and city find their common ground. The love that beauty inspires is what makes beauty a civic necessity. Beauty gives rise to love, and without love, there would be no community, no society, no culture, no city. Again in myth, we are told that eros is the creative binding force that allows existence to emerge from chaos. It is eros that allows all things to intermingle, to come together to form relationships, and so procreate the cosmos. And so in the beating heart of every village, town, and city lies the foundational presence of beauty and love. One of Aristotle's most famous statements is that man is by nature a political animal. He believed that humans have a natural desire to come together, whether in search of a partner or spouse, the creation of a family household, the binding together of numerous households to establish a tribe or village, or the larger congregation of villages that results in cities and states. For Aristotle, this last form of human bonding, the polis, was the highest form of human interaction. In the polis, the city is what offers the greatest opportunity for humans to reach their highest potential. He wrote that although the polis comes into existence for the sake of life, it exists for the good life. In its etymological roots, the word polis means throng, crowd, ruddy. It's connected, for instance, with pollude or swamp, pour, flow, fill up, flood, overflow, swim. It is innately plural, poly, many. The polis mirrors the communal cosmos that lives through each of our souls, the flow of the many images that constitute and fill us up, the throng and crowd of ideas, fantasies, and visions that appear both in dreams and in city streets, with their overflowing flood of people that run and pour through them. We swim in their mix, part of the many that is the polis. Concrete and steel belie the moist earth that lies below. My city, Chicago, was built on a swamp. Our souls are reflections of the polytheistic soul of the polis that is inherently diverse, a tapestry of ethnicities, traditions, rhythms, and cuisines that give the city its vitality and charm. If we are by nature political animals, then our appropriate place within a well-ordered cosmos is the polis. And it is only through our interactions within the polis that we can be fully realized. As political animals, people and city are inextricably woven together, microcosm and macrocosm reflecting one another, just like the old ideas said. It is the polis that makes possible our deeper and broader being, that makes us human. Perhaps that is why so many people dream of going to the city, drawn to the polis as that place where they can achieve their potential and fulfill their dreams. How misguided we are when we retreat to the wilderness or introspect and look within to find ourselves, when what we seek lies in the natural habitat of the political animal, the throbbing, pulsing polis. If our souls are at least partly constituted by the polis, then to serve and care for soul, we must serve and care for the polis. The proper site for psychotherapy, psychotherapia, would no longer be the quiet consulting room with drawn curtains, that most apt metaphor for how we tend to think of the soul as isolated, withdrawn, and interior, but rather the places where humans come together by the nature of our animal and political sensibilities, in our villages and cities. Soul making happens in the streets, in architecture and urban design, in the hustle and bustle of commuter trains and the crowded sidewalks at lunchtime. John Keats wrote, "Call the world, if you please, the vale of soul making, then you will find the use of the world." But for too long, we have misconstrued his meaning. The use of the world is not for our soul making, but rather the world's soul making. Soul making takes place in the public sphere, far more than in private introspection. Soul needs the proliferation of images that the city provides, the diversity, the sights and smells, the dangerous shadows, and the shocks, the white bread homogeneity. Although we each reverberate with images that we experience as interior, we mistakenly come to believe that we are the source of these images, that they belong to us and arise from our so-called personal subjectivity. But the city will not permit such a reduction. because the city is so thoroughly not personal. The skyscrapers and alleyways, the shops with their windows and awnings and displays, the polished business person and the busker on the subway platform, they are as unneedy of our introspections as are the mountains and the valleys, the overstory and its underlings, and the animals that inspirit there. The city, in its glorious diversity, gives form to the soul's ongoing, spontaneous creation of fantasy images. It is the soul that imagines us, and we exist within soul, just as we exist within the cosmos and the city. To care for something is to help it become more beautiful, more fully what it longs to be. By becoming more beautiful, things realize their fate, unfolding and revealing their destiny. This kind of care requires more than concern and encouragement, more than a regimen of policies and procedures, more even than a sense of duty or responsibility. This kind of care requires love. And nothing inspires love like beauty. When something is beautiful, we are drawn to it and often come to love it. When we love something, we want to take care of it, to protect it, and to make things possible for it that would not have been possible without our love. It is through beauty and love, then, that we attend to the natural ordering of the cosmos and the enduring life of the polis. By contributing our talents, skills, and imagining, we help cosmos and city embrace a more differentiated vision about what they are and what they can be. The more this vision takes place, the more deeply it is imagined, the more beautiful cosmos and city become, and the more they reveal their possibilities and track the course of their destinies. The polis, of course, gives rise to politics, one of the natural activities of political animals. In my country, our politics are in bad shape. We have a sharply divided populace, and extreme ideologues at the polar ends of right and left have far too much influence. There is little trust, and even families are being divided by the growing zealotry and fundamentalism of both right and left. The best way that I can describe our political affairs is that they are ugly. The language of political discourse has become simplistic and insulting, lacking in grace and full of spite and innuendo. Sincerity and open-mindedness are considered weak and naive. Arrogance and bullying are mistaken for strength, and ignorance is celebrated as a virtue. What we have lost is the realization that although we are political animals, we are first aesthetic animals. The practice of politics should therefore be aesthetic, and the goal of politics should be to serve beauty. When politics loses its foundation in beauty, it likewise loses love and soul, depriving polis of the essential elements it needs to exist and flourish. Ugliness weakens our aesthetic and political natures and perpetuates the separation we feel from each other and the greater cosmos. The pathology of our politics derives from the repression of beauty, and the divisiveness that plagues us comes from the lack of love that results from that repression. So, what are we to do? Clearly, calls for morality, duty, and responsibility are not enough. They have been tried and failed. And love, which has the power to address the afflictions that our hubris has created, love cannot be summoned at will. What we need is a way to restore our connection to Aphrodite, Eros, and Psyche, those gods that we have neglected and thereby insulted. Hillman offers a suggestion. certainly not for redemption, but at least as a way to re-engage our aesthetic, political, ethical, and psychological sensibilities. Because our Western tradition has anesthetized us to beauty, we are limited in our ability to sense the beauty that is everywhere. So instead, we can follow our psychotherapeutic tradition and begin with the symptom that has us in its grip, ugliness. Instead of rejecting the symptom, we can engage it and enter it. Plotinus tells us that an ugly thing, and by ugly he includes evil, bad, turpitude, shameful, and obscene. Ugly is something that has not been, as he put it, entirely mastered by pattern. Hillman takes this to mean that, quote, an ugly thing has no encompassing and profound idea of what the thing wants to be. The ugly lacks contemplative thought about itself, and it therefore cannot be truly what it is. It is not true to itself, and consequently, it cannot be beautiful or good. And please note here again, the inseparable relationship between aesthetics and ethics. Elsewhere, Plotinus says that we possess beauty when we are true to our own being. Our ugliness is going over to another order. Here, Hillman takes Plotinus to mean that, quote, we move toward the ugly when we desert the aesthetic position. We move toward the ugly when we desert the aesthetic position. Thus, when we repress beauty or subjugate aesthetics to bureaucratic restrictions, cost-benefit analyses, or political ideologies, we fall into ugliness. When we lack contemplative thought and respect for the destiny that strives to live through us, we are ugly. And when we are true to that destiny, and thereby true to ourselves, we are beautiful. Plotinus also makes a critical point, writing that let the soul fall in with the ugly, and at once it shrinks within itself, denies the thing, turns away from it, not accordant, resenting it. Here, Plotinus and Hillman call upon us to have the courage of our aesthetic convictions. We have a political, ethical, and psychological duty to trust and defend our immediate responses that recoil from what assaults and insults our aesthetic sensibilities. Each of us can come up with our own list of ugliness. Drab buildings with tacky and tacked-on art, inhumane and uncivilizing urban design, anthropogenic climate change and its devastating impacts, toxic partisanship, manipulation of education to serve ideological means, and the snarling face of bigotry. I could continue with my list, but I ask instead that each of you make your own list of the ugliness that sets you off and that tries to take us over to another order. Your list identifies for you where you sense the aesthetic, animate cosmos is being disrespected, insulted, and hurt. But because the modern mind has declared the cosmos to be without soul, we can only feel these sufferings as our own personal sufferings. We are unable to feel the anguish of an anorectic building or the oppression of a censored history curriculum, and therefore we lose our ethical responsibility to them. People think they are bringing personal problems and difficulties to therapy, when what they are really bringing are souls lost in a lifeless cosmos, adrift and detached because we have turned away from the ordering powers of beauty and the binding force of love. If there are two things that throughout history have instilled courage, they are beauty and love. Ask yourself, for whom or what would you fight? For whom or what would you die? For many, the answer will be family. For others, the answer might be flag. But for every virtuous answer, it will be based in beauty and love. This is important because your list not only tells you what offends you, it also tells you where you must resist. The affront of ugliness is a call to political action, and such action could not be more necessary or critical. Political action is always embodied action. It means standing up and stepping forward, not shrinking back and turning away. Like the heroes that we admire, the aesthetic warrior heads toward the ugly, refusing to succumb to repulsion or fear. And this very act of drawing closer to that which offends us enlivens the aesthetic spirit. The blood rises and the heart quickens. Our reaction to beauty and ugliness help to restore our place in the cosmos because, and this is Hillman again, the world is primarily and always an aesthetic phenomenon with which our animal senses and innate reactions are attuned. As political animals, then, we must learn, or perhaps relearn, that our aesthetic instincts are our surest guides when it comes to life within the polis. Street smarts extend beyond knowing which sections of town to avoid. We instinctively know that if something is ugly, it will not benefit the polis, regardless of the promise of lower cost or increased efficiencies. Indeed, these latter two culprits are at the base of so much ugliness. We are so used to our political discussions being dominated by economic concerns or bureaucratic definitions of productivity that we allow them to overpower our aesthetic sensibilities, to discern the good from the bad and the just from the unjust. But I remain convinced that those sensibilities are still there, bred in our animal bones, given with the visceral wisdom of the heart, that central organ of aesthetic, erotic, and ethical perception. That is why the heart swells and grows fuller when touched by beauty and love, and why it shrinks and breaks when ugliness prevails. Only through beauty can we restore our natures as political animals, by having the unrelenting courage to insist that political judgments are aesthetic judgments. Politics is the art of making beauty and thereby making soul. And only through beauty and soul can we more fully realize the polis. And only when the polis is properly served can the political animals that live there partake in the aesthetic splendor of an ensouled cosmos. A polis in service to beauty and inspired by love brings with it a deep sense of community. The more a person can appreciate and contribute to the beauty of their community, the more fully realized the community will become, and the more the person will feel a sense of belonging. It is important to remember that community is always tied to a particular place that is neither abstract nor transcendent. That is why ideologies cannot make community, because they are by nature displaced and free-floating, and therefore prone to excess. Ideologies both exclude others, while at the same time being inherently imperialistic. Because they believe in their righteousness, they constantly seek to expand their control and influence. And in this sense, ideology is antithetical to community. Real community grounds the soul by giving it a place to put down roots and to flourish. Just as the polis affords people possibilities they would not otherwise have, so too people afford the polis opportunities to be more deeply and fully realized. Psyche, or soul, has always been associated with depth and deepening. It belongs to the valleys and shades, not to the peaks and arid brightness. And so a community must grow down if it is to grow up, just as the deepening of soul over time contributes to maturity, wisdom, and fullness of being. As political animals, we can contribute to this deepening by honoring and maintaining the polis in all of its aspects, both visible and invisible. We can care for the land that supports our homes and buildings and nourishes the flora and fauna, land that also contains the bodies, memories, and dreams of our ancestors. We can find better ways to live in concert with our natural environment, reducing our negative impact on the greater cosmos. And we can maintain and beautify our public facilities and infrastructure, not only to allow for their continued use by us, but to demonstrate to them our shared respect for their importance. In all of this, I am suggesting that soul making occurs first and best through selfless service to the polis, a place that for the Greeks was a place of devotion to all of the gods. But within the pantheon, Aphrodite had a special place within the polis. One of Aphrodite's epithets is Aphrodite Pandemos, which means common to or of all the people. According to this view, it is Aphrodite's beauty and sensuality that gives rise to our natures as aesthetic and political animals. And it is through devotion to beauty that we best serve the polis. Real community, Hillman once said, does not develop out of the neediness of individuals, but rather out of their desire and ability to contribute. The last thing I would like to talk with you about perhaps seems out of place with this group, given the extraordinary natural beauty in which your cities are nestled. But there are religious, philosophical, and scientific traditions that influence the Western mind that think that humans are separate from nature. I outline the history of this troubling tradition in my book, Return to Beauty, that Marcus showed earlier. But for our purposes today, I want to touch on the ramifications of this idea for the life of the city. After all, the alleged separation of the human from nature gives rise to the notion that the city is separate from nature, and that therefore nature as such cannot exist within the city. Landscape architecture might offer facsimiles or imitations of nature, but nature must forever lay beyond the city. Even though these human-made creations might be beautiful, they still are not the real thing. Nature cannot be in the city because according to our reigning ideas, nature must be out there, away from the making and construction of the human hand. Nature is only where we are not. What is it, though, that draws us to nature? What hold do the snow-capped peaks, the dense jungle, and the rolling sea have on our soul? What makes us long to leave the city, heading for the hills or setting sail? It is, of course, beauty that attracts us to nature. And it seems that it is the particulars of nature that most strike us. A fox that suddenly appears in the woods, or the sun glistening off of an icicle, illuminating its divinity. Nature is constantly presenting us with exquisite, particular displays of beauty. Even the panorama of a mountain range or the infinite blaze of the night sky are given to us as precise images of beauty. And so here we arrive at the issue. If we place beauty with nature and then place nature outside the city, is the city to be left devoid of nature and beauty? To this, we can answer that beauty is not limited to nature and that nature is not separate from the city. Beauty manifests in the creation of the fine arts, in the smooth precision of tools, and in the majesty of the city skyline, just as surely as it does in mountain ranges and the vast oceans. The effect of beauty on the soul shares common purchase in the art museum and the forest. Think how we walk softly with hushed, reverent tones in both. Think how particular things, be they animal or sculpture, can arrest our forward push, catching our breath, racing our pulse. We simply are mistaken in separating the human city and non-human nature. The fact that beauty shines forth in both shows that they belong together. Both cosmos and city arise from the revealing and ordering power of beauty. To deny the city its natural place alongside the mountains and the sea is therefore a cosmological error that has profound psychological effects. More, the repression of beauty is nowhere stronger than when we try to deny the city its natural beauty. When we banish beauty and nature to out there, beyond the city, we leave the city barren, faceless, and cold. The repression of beauty lies at the heart of so many urban problems: pollution, congestion, inequality of educational and income opportunities, wasteful energy use. These are all beauty disorders. When the city is no longer seen as beautiful, we cease to care about it. We feel no ethical connection either to it or its inhabitants, and each of us is left an island adrift in a dead sea of res extensa. A city without beauty is a loveless place. Its buildings and streets cheapened and forlorn because they are considered mere matter, having no soul. And when the city is denied its intrinsic beauty and value, it must, of course, proliferate, sprawling to make up with quantity what it is deprived in quality. As you can see, repressing beauty and denying the city its natural place in the cosmos can have practical and indeed catastrophic effects. To counter these negative outcomes, we need only refuse the false divide between city and nature, thereby returning both to beauty. Just as de Kooning said, nature is not somewhere out there, but it is right here, within reach of our outstretched arms. A bird nest, a beaver lodge, and my suburban home differ in degree, but not in kind. My footprints belong in the sand as much as the sandpipers. The sky outside my window is the same sky that caps the mountain range. The water from my tap is linked to the falling rain and snow, and the salt in my body connects me to the vast sea that lies bluing beyond the shore. I am not in nature. I am of nature. I am part of the natural reciprocal penetration of microcosm and macrocosm. The stars and planets are within me, just as I send images of heart and blood to them. By returning to beauty, we regain appreciation for nature and all things, including the human-made, architecture, urban design, traffic patterns, roads, and bridges. All are aesthetic constructs, as natural as the trees and rocks that grace the landscape. The polis is also constituted by ideas, fantasies, festivals, songs, dance, and affairs of the heart. The city is where cultures blossom and where ingenuity imagines and creates the future. But the city also holds the memories and often the bodies of our ancestors. The cityscape shows the outlines of its growth and decay over time, the scars of its battles. The city is history in flesh as well as in concrete and steel, ever present and reminding us of the past and the inevitability of death. When the city is returned to beauty and its natural place within the cosmos, the gods too reappear, no longer exiled by neglect. Think for a moment how the life of the city would change if beauty was placed as a central concern. Think how politics, jurisprudence, ethics, policy and budget considerations, design and construction concerns, educational methods and curricula, housing, use of public green space, and urban planning. Think how they would change if our first questions were aesthetic instead of economic. What if instead of functionality being measured only in terms of productivity, we judge policies and procedures on the beauty of their form, the grace of their composition, and the value they contribute to the polis and the well-being of its soul? I have said that we exist to appreciate beauty, to create beauty, and to be beautiful, and that the cosmos asks nothing more from us. If we were to live in such a manner, we would naturally treat the cosmos with reverence and respect. In such a cosmos, we would not separate humans and our creations from nature, or try to segregate our lives as political animals from the other animals with whom we share a common home. Our cities would be places where people, all people, could fully realize their callings and destiny. Beauty would be released from the galleries and wilderness and called home once again to flourish in the polis. By loving this cosmos in all of its ensouled radiance, we would grow wings, and we would look constantly for new ways to serve the anima mundi. Soul, with its images and myths, would grow us downward, deepening us with its spontaneous creativity and quiet animal certainty. Each of us would serve in the temple of beauty, thereby engendering love and fulfilling love's desire for soul. In so doing, we would encourage and enable both cosmos and city to realize their unique destinies. And perhaps, just perhaps, Aphrodite would smile. Thank you. I look forward to talking with you.
Benjamin, excelente, excelente apresentação. Eu ouvi
Thank you very much.
Eu ouvi aqui como se fosse um manifesto, menos um texto, uma apresentação, e mais um manifesto, uma ode à beleza. Obrigado pelas suas ideias. Pessoal, vamos conversar então com o Benjamin. Quem quiser fazer perguntas, por favor, coloque o nome no chat e eu chamo, tá bom? Queria começar, Benjamin, e queria começar te dizendo o seguinte: apesar do Brasil ser um país de belezas naturais abundantes, nós somos um país onde a feiura está completamente presente. E nós vivemos, nos últimos 4 anos, um governo, uma política da feiura declaradamente posta como estratégia política. Então, quando você fala da política dos Estados Unidos, é importante você saber que aqui também não é. A feiura está plenamente disseminada no Brasil. E a gente está tentando introduzir porções de beleza, mas vai ser difícil. Queria, a partir disso, te colocar a seguinte questão. Como a gente pode pensar numa política da beleza, né? No seu livro, você usa uma frase que eu gosto muito, da beleza como necessidade cívica. Acho uma ótima expressão. como é que nós podemos pensar numa política da beleza sustentada nos valores de alma, eros, polis, cosmos, diante de uma cultura tão secular, né, governada cada vez mais por tecnicismos, tecnologia, império da técnica? Como poder fazer efetivamente da beleza uma espécie de princípio político e de um ativismo mesmo, no sentido de modificação das condições reais da cidade? Você tem uma experiência, né, na sua cidade como, eu não sei qual é o nome que se dá no inglês, não sei se é prefeito, mas qual foi a sua experiência em Riversdale?
First, let me say that I cannot help but feel that the United States and the political culture that we lived under for 4 years didn't have something to do with some of the problems that exist in your country as well. There are stark similarities between the ugliness that we have experienced and the ugliness that you have experienced. I can tell you that as mayor, I was fortunate to have as a partner a village manager who felt as I did that our primary responsibility to our community was to increase its beauty and deepen its soul. Every decision that we made were aesthetic and psychological decisions. Overtly so. We actually enunciated those words and those principles when we would deal with our engineers, with our architects, with our finance people. The first thing that I think would help, and Hillman was excellent about this, is to regain a fuller and more respectful idea about what beauty is. We have reduced beauty to the effete. We have held it prisoner to our beholding eye, such that it's me. I decide. Each of us decides what is beautiful. It's a subjective judgment, and that is a catastrophic mistake. The beauty that I believe Hillman championed, and I appreciate very much the idea that what I just said can be taken as a manifesto of sorts. The beauty I'm talking about is cosmological. It is a foundation of all that is. In the myths, beauty, and especially Eros, are the creators. They are the generators of all that is, including the gods. And the more we can accept beauty at that fundamental level as being constitutive of all that we are, the more we can get away from the idea that somehow beauty is not practical. There is nothing more practical than beauty. There is nothing more essential to economic well-being or educational opportunity than beauty. But we have to shift our way of thinking away from the reigning ideologies of economics, productivity, efficiency, to once again see the cosmos and the polis as an essential, as essentially aesthetic.
Perfeito, perfeito. Vamos lá, vamos abrir para as perguntas. Obrigado, Ben. Lu, vamos lá?
Bem, super obrigada pela sua lindíssima palestra. Eu queria muito que você fosse prefeito aqui de São Paulo. Continuando um pouco a conversa que a gente teve lá antes, né, que você perguntou onde eu morava, onde o Marcos estava e tal, e que a minha resposta, se eu tivesse escutado a sua palestra antes, eu não teria respondido o que eu respondi, né, que eu respondi que Rio de Janeiro é melhor, Salvador melhor ainda do que Rio de Janeiro, E toda a minha resposta foi muito baseada na natureza que tem na cidade do Rio e na cidade de Salvador, né? E aí, enquanto você estava falando, eu fiquei pensando, porque esse meu jeito de ver São Paulo, e que eu acho que não é só meu, acho que é dos paulistanos, eu acho que dos brasileiros em geral. São Paulo é vista como uma cidade onde seres enlouquecidos vivem, workaholics, pessoas que não sabem aproveitar a vida, né? E tem uma música de um cantor aqui chamado Criolo, que ele fala, não existe amor em SP. Então, eu acho que é esse o mito que a gente está inserido aqui em São Paulo, né? Então, eu acho que isso é só uma colocação, porque eu acho que a gente precisa resgatar a beleza de São Paulo para que a gente encontre o amor em SP, né? Mas a minha pergunta é outra. Isso aqui foi só para te dizer que eu vou responder diferente da próxima vez que a gente falar sobre a cidade de São Paulo. A minha pergunta é a seguinte, pensando em nós como analistas, né, e que eu concordo plenamente com você que a gente precisa sair dos consultórios, que a vida está fora dos consultórios, das cortinas fechadas e etc. Isso é sempre um dilema para mim. O que fazer, como fazer para sair dos consultórios, né? Porque a gente trabalha nos consultórios, tem o setting terapêutico, tem o vaso alquímico, tem toda uma teoria que a gente segue e que a gente respeita para que um processo analítico funcione. Eu queria te ouvir falar um pouco mais sobre essa história de sair dos consultórios, a psicoterapia precisa sair dos consultórios.
Yes, that's a very deep and important question to me. For many years when I was a practicing therapist, I often felt a conflict when I would sit with people in a quiet room with the windows shut, where none of the sounds or smells of the city could get to us. And I'll tell you a story. I had a client one time who was extremely self-centered. She tried to turn everything into an introspection or personal reflection. And I was doing my best to try to move her away from that habit. And I remember very clearly one day she said to me, "You care more about this building than you care about me." And I said to her, "That isn't true. I don't care more about the building than I care about you. But I care as much about the building as I do you." Because that was the source of her dissonance. One of the themes of my work, and this comes directly from Hillman's work, is that if we are aesthetic animals, if that is our very nature, what happens when the ideas that we have, that we use to think about ourselves, like the self, which is perhaps a great problem, what happens when those ideas are in conflict with what our intuitive animal natures are telling us? I think that is the source of much of what comes into a therapist's office. As Jim used to say, it's our ideas that need therapy, not the person, but the ideas, how we imagine ourselves and the world and how we are in the world. This idea that humans could somehow be separate from nature, that has catastrophic psychological effects. So to try to restore our sense of beauty and our sense of our erotic connection to the world requires us to leave the consulting room. It requires us to try to therapize not people so much as culture. And it's interesting that I'm sure all of you know much about history, about Hillman's on biography and history. That was the trajectory of his work. As he got older, the older he got, the more he got away from personal therapy with trying to do therapy for the city and the world. I wanted to show you all this. I found this in my library. This is an old monograph, City and Soul, by Jim from 1978 in Dallas, when he had moved there. And that was the time that I came to know him. So I was honored to be able to watch that shift. But to more directly answer your question, we as therapists have to therapize our ideas about what therapy is and how it is practiced. We have to be willing to radically revision, in my view, how we imagine the soul and soul making. As Marcus knows, in all of my books, I consistently rail against the idea of the self as somehow secret, that you can't know me, that only I can know me because I am privy to the private thoughts and words that I hear within. I think that's crazy. I think that the idea that the people who know us and love us don't know as much about us, if not more about us than we know about ourselves, is one of the great afflictions of our time. All of us are old enough to know that the ideas we have in our heads about ourselves are not trustworthy. They cannot be trusted. We are consistently and repeatedly wrong about ourselves. And yet we persist in the theory that the self is somehow personal, when in fact the self is political. The self is communal. We are each a polis. We are each a community of images. Our individuality comes from the unique way in which we give form and substance to the gods that live through us, which is a very freeing way of starting to imagine oneself. I hope that helps.
Super, obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Dani, querida, vamos lá?
Olá, Benjamin, muito obrigada pelas suas palavras, sua palestra. Tiaços, meus amigos queridos também proporcionando esses encontros maravilhosos, né? E eu queria pegar um gancho aqui com a Lu, né? Que com certeza existe amor em SP. E eu acho que um dos nomes do amor de SP é a nossa comunidade, os nossos amigos, nossos ganchos, né? Os vínculos. Mas, numa cidade como São Paulo, eu acho que fica cada vez mais difícil, né? Assim, enganchar, né? Assim, buscar e se vincular com essas belezas, né? E eu acho que desde o começo, assim, a história de São Paulo ela foi construída desse modo, né? De que a gente pertencia, né? Construiu aqui num núcleo, encontramos recursos para construir a cidade e cada vez mais a gente foi buscando para fora, né? Então a gente usufruía, esgotava e a gente ia cada vez mais para fora e talvez isso seja a nossa repetição, né? De sempre buscar essa beleza fora e não aqui dentro, porque aqui dentro a gente está de alguma forma usufruindo e destruindo também, né? Mas a minha pergunta é a seguinte, se a gente está doentes, né, de falta de beleza, anestesiados, atrofiados, né, existe um termo que tem sido falado bastante agora, que é o ponto de não retorno, né? Que significa que a gente chega a um ponto da destruição de que não há mais forma de regeneração, né? E se você acha que podemos chegar a algum ponto de não retorno em relação a essa atrofia da beleza, né? Se a gente vai chegar um momento em que essa beleza a gente vai buscar tanto fora, a gente vai dar a volta ao mundo e não vai encontrar mais onde enganchar. Essa é a minha pergunta fatídica.
I think I'm always suspicious of myself when I get hopeful. But if you look at what's happening in the United States, and from what I know also happening in Brazil, we did pull back from the precipice. We do have an opportunity in both of our countries at renewal. It is still very perilous, frighteningly perilous, but the opportunity is there. As I don't know how many of you are therapists or analysts, but I know that you're all very well steeped in therapy and analysis. Breakdown is necessary. Breakdown is an essential part of the therapeutic model. No real change, in my view, can come absent breakdown. And usually the more significant that breakdown is, the more possibility and opportunity arises at the other end. What I was trying to say in my talk today, and perhaps the most important part of it to me, is that we cannot allow despair to reduce our courage. We must each be an aesthetic warrior. We must each trust our visceral animal response to the world and the ugliness that appears there and counteract it. When I was mayor, part of my responsibility was to speak out against the ugliness that seeked to infect our community. Ideology, fundamentalism, zealotry, bigotry. These are the evils of our time. And as therapists and analysts, what I think is important for us to realize is that each of those things has as their primary interest rejecting the power of imagination. That is why the dictators and the autocrats come for the writers and the actors and the artists. They know intuitively that the imagination is irrepressibly free. The essence of freedom, of independence, is the imagination. And so by standing for the imagination, by trying to resurrect beauty and love, and think for a second in our modern minds, what we have done to those words. Think of how we have made beauty diminutive, how we have allowed love to be taken over as something syrupy and sentimental, when these are words of enormous power, enormous power. The heart filled with beauty and inspired by love is irrepressible. And that is the source of my hope for the future. The poet Rilke had a phrase that is one of my favorites. Beauty is everywhere. As I sit here and look at this screen and see the walls behind all of you, there is so much beauty right here on this screen. And we live amongst it. The smiles that I see are beautiful. But, and this was one of Rilke's great gifts to us as a poet, we have to once again shift our sensibility to see with an eye. Rodin, the artist, said, you need to see with an eye grafted to the heart. Grafted to the heart. So what I am trying to suggest is that beauty and love are courageous. They swell the heart, and they give us the tools, the practical tools that we need to push back against the ugly that seeks to take us over to another order, as Plotinus said.
Obrigado, Dani. Olhos polidos pelo coração. Bela frase, Benjamin. Bela frase. Martinha, querida, contigo.
Oi, boa noite. Primeiro, agradecer demais aí a palestra, fala da beleza, e uma palestra realmente belíssima, né? Frases aí ficaram assim, anotei até algumas que achei maravilhosas, né? Quando você falou, né, das pessoas que vêm para terapia, né, que parecem que trazem coisas, né, casos individuais, mas que trazem almas perdidas em um cosmos sem vida. Isso, para mim, ficou a maior definição mesmo, acho que, desse processo, né? Mas eu queria só trazer uma coisa, né? Como lidar com essa questão da beleza, né? E a gente dá para associar isso à inteligência artificial? A inteligência artificial, ela pode criar beleza, ela pode, né? Ou isso é uma feiura necessária, desnecessária, nosso mundo, como é que ele está, né? Então, só para questionar um pouco isso, esse aspecto, né, muito tecnológico, mas que nós estamos aqui dentro da tecnologia, né? Mas eu queria, não sei se você tem alguma coisa para pensar sobre isso.
I'm not sure I can say anything of great substance about that because it's something that's so far beyond my understanding. My immediate response is that the intelligence of which it speaks is artificial. It is not actual intelligence. And the beauty that we can, I mean, I know that there are programs that can do paintings and do drawings and, but what it lacks, what it cannot portray is the heart's attachment to those images. The sensual aspect of beauty that is given by Aphrodite and Eros and Psyche. You all know that story. You all know the story of Aphrodite and Eros and Psyche. What is significant about it is that they require one another. This is one of the great lessons of myth, is that you can't just have one, that the entire pantheon is always there. But there is a particular connection of extreme importance, I would say foundational importance, between Aphrodite and Eros and Psyche. The book that I just finished and sent to the publisher is called Love's Desire. And what's critical from a therapeutic standpoint, and I think this has something to do with what you're asking, is that love's desire is for soul. And soul's desire is for Eros. And neither of them are capable of being fulfilled and fully realized until their marriage is finally accomplished. And it's at the end of that story when Eros and Psyche are finally reunited and are finally married. That is when Aphrodite shifts from this kind of nasty god that she was earlier in the story to finally dance. And all of the gods consummate the relationship between Eros and Psyche. And at that point, Psyche becomes immortal. And it is through their relationship that Psyche then bears a child. So it is that connection that is not artificial. It is that connection that is visceral and of an animal nature. It's one thing to see a facsimile of nature, as I mentioned earlier. Hillman was wonderful about saying that if we want to bring nature back into the city, we don't bring artificial examples of nature to the city. We make the city itself more natural. That's what we try to do in therapy as well. We try to shift the imagination of the client away from their self-centeredness and back into the anima mundi, the world soul. I will tell you one story I heard yesterday. Is there chat GPT or something like that in Brazil? It's an artificial intelligence program. I'm not seeing yet. Two lawyers here in the United States had that program write a legal brief for them. And the legal brief included citations to case law that did not exist. And now these two lawyers are likely going to be disbarred from using that program to write their legal brief. And I can tell you as a lawyer, the first thing that you do when you get a legal brief from the other side is go through and check every single one of its citations. So I don't think that, at least in the legal profession, I suspect we're not going to be relying too much on artificial intelligence. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's about the best I can do.
Foi ótima. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Martinha, minha bela. Benjamin, vou ler uma pergunta da Melina, tá bom? Benjamin, Isa, dá para ler, Isa? No chat? Benjamin, agradeço a oportunidade de te ouvir e gostaria de te fazer uma pergunta. Hillman comenta em sua publicação A Prática da Beleza que uma das manifestações da repressão da beleza estaria no que alguns chamam de narcisismo, ou a doença da beleza. O que você poderia nos dizer sobre isso?
That's the wonderful question. I would say that, and this goes back to what I was talking about a little earlier with regard to the idea of the self as a secret, private possession. The problem, as I see it, is, and Hillman is correct, absolutely correct about this, narcissism turns our face away from the other faces of the world. It is perhaps the most rampant pathology, psychopathology of the modern mind. Narcissism is baked into our ideas about how we think about ourselves as isolated. One of the things that I have spent a lot of time trying to get across in my work is, and this is particularly a problem that originates here in the United States, is that independence, the idea of independence, means isolated, separate, alone. The classic heroes in the United States, are almost always solitary. They lack community. It's the cowboy on a horse comes into town alone, and then at the end of the story leaves on his horse alone, always a he. And a better view of independence is to see where we are in dependence, to see where we are held and supported by the world, what we depend upon. Narcissism negates that move by keeping us fixated on ourselves. This goes back to my idea that all of you now, in the time that we've been together here, all of you now know things about me that I don't know about myself, which is why I need you, which is why I am dependent upon you to reflect back to me what it is I can afford the cosmos. If we look back at our lives and ask ourselves, what has the world come to me for? What have people asked of me? This goes back to when Jim said, community doesn't come from the neediness of individuals, but from what we can contribute. By opening our imaginations to the idea that I exist as much in your imagination as I exist in my thought about myself. By giving myself, by opening myself and letting myself be vulnerable and welcoming to your ideas, your images, your imagination about me, we gain a fuller, richer, and I think more honest view of who and what we are. Narcissism negates that. Narcissism is all about self-reflection, the pool, the face. Whereas the work of beauty and love and soul releases us back into a world that constitutes us. I love this idea that I exist more fully in your imagination, that I need your imagination to be realized. That is what, in my view, the polis represents. And that is why Aristotle is correct, in my view, that it is the city that is the place where we can most fully be realized as aesthetic and political animals.
Obrigado, bem. Obrigado, Melina. Excelente resposta. Excelente. Diogo, vamos lá, meu querido.
Thank you for the question.
Olá, boa noite. Boa noite, Benjamin. Boa noite, pessoal. Estou conseguindo me ouvir?
Sim.
Tá. Me interessou bastante uma parte da tua apresentação, onde você falava sobre fazer uma lista daquilo que é feio, né? E aí a gente poderia identificar pelo que a gente poderia lutar por, né? Algo assim, se eu entendi direito. Essa parte ativou diversas faíscas aqui na minha cabeça. Fiquei lembrando de alguns exemplos aqui no Brasil, onde uma suposta feiura ela foi subvertida a partir do trabalho de alguns artistas, né? Seja na cultura hip hop, onde canta a violência ou o drama das ruas, mas criando uma maneira esteticamente brilhante de sobreviver a isso. Até um artista que tem aqui no Brasil, né, que ele faz miniaturas das comunidades, das favelas, e ao trazer o nosso olhar para o diminuto daquela estética, daquele lugar que é abandonado pelo Estado, pelo investimento público, e que, por consequência, deveria se tornar feio, até com uma política de governo, de tornar a vida das pessoas pior, ele resgata um pouco de beleza e cria uma nova organização estética para isso. Então, eu queria trazer um pouco para a ideia de feiura. Eu fico pensando como que você poderia ajudar a gente a pensar de que maneira a gente consegue estabelecer uma relação com a feiura para além de uma saída heróica de lutar por ou combater a feiura, mas de erotizar a feiura dentro da experiência clínica, dentro da feiura relatada pelos nossos pacientes nas suas vivências cotidianas, algo nesse sentido.
Thank you, Eva, for that question. I think the way I can respond to that is, as you so well put it, the response to ugliness. I mean, that's what people bring to the therapist. They bring suffering, they bring pain, they bring fears. And our job is not to repulse that, but rather to enter into it and to find, as Plotinus would put it, how do we allow those things to be more fully mastered by pattern? So we have to be careful not to fall into some kind of false dichotomy between beauty and ugly. And I think Plotinus gives us the best avenue for this. We are beautiful when we are true to our own being. That being includes many aspects of ugliness. None of us are free from that. But to be true to that, to accept those aspects of ourselves, our pettiness, our own private bigotries that are there, I think, certainly in me, and I suspect in most people. What I think Jim was trying to suggest to us is that because we become anesthetized to beauty, we have to rely on ugliness to reinvigorate and to spark our aesthetic sensibilities. Ugliness gets our attention more in many ways than does beauty. So the idea, my idea, would be that when we encounter ugliness, we try not to take the heroic stance, but we try to take an aesthetic stance. We try to find ways to work within the myths that are guiding us, to find ways to reconfigure, recompose, to reorient, to put a different face on the ugliness that we encounter. One thing that we all know, and again, I can cite the political experience here, and I suspect it's similar there. Questions of ugliness are not resolved through rational thought. You're not going to convince a fundamentalist to be other than they are. Because the problem with the fundamentalist mind is it doesn't believe. It believes that it knows. And so there's no way to contradict that through rational means. There are ways to contradict that through aesthetic means, by trying to move the person away from the ugliness that limits their experience with the greater cosmos, that limits their experience of themselves as being encompassed and constituted by the greater cosmos, to a view that is based in restoring beauty and love to the world. I truly believe that only beauty and love they're the only things that have the power to negate the perilous times and the ugliness that confront us right now as people. Rational thought simply isn't up to it. And that's not to denigrate. I mean, I just gave a very heady and intellectual talk, but its aim was beauty. I used language of the mind, but my goal was to reach the heart.
Obrigado, Diogo. Benjamin, queria fazer uma pergunta mais biográfica agora. Acabou de sair o volume 2 da biografia do Hillman, pelo Dick Russell, e ele aborda exatamente esse período da década de 70. Pois é, já chegou aqui também. E ele aborda essa chegada do Hillman, esse retorno dele aos Estados Unidos, o período de Dallas, as Terry Lectures. A minha pergunta é, como é que um advogado foi se interessar pelas ideias da psicologia arquetípica? E onde é que você estava nesse momento?
That's a great question, Marcus. So I moved to Dallas in 1977 to go to graduate school at Southern Methodist University. And one of my first teachers there was Thomas More. And Tom and I have known each other.
Benjamin. O Thomas More esteve aqui conosco também, no Tiaços. Só para te localizar.
Yes, I saw that. I watched that. He's a wonderful man. I love him deeply. So I met Tom at SMU, and that was almost exactly the same time that Jim came to Dallas, and he and Tom became close friends, and then it was through Tom that I became friends with Jim, and so I worked my degree was in philosophical psychology, and the thesis I wrote was an analysis of the idea of image in the works of Jung and Hillman. But an interesting autobiographical part here. The first thesis that I wrote, with Tom's blessing and support, was on Sophia. The idea of Sophia as the God that inspires philosophia, that inspires philosophy. And my thesis was that the mind that is used in philosophy is not appropriate as the kind of mind that can truly love Sophia. I personally consider Hillman our greatest philosopher. I would, and it's interesting in this new volume. In fact, here, let me just read something to you. This really was important when I read this. This is a quote from Thomas More. He calls Hillman the greatest thinker who ever lived, more important than Aristotle, Plato, Heidegger, and Blake. I have thought that for a long time, and it actually brought tears to my eyes when I read that Tom had said that as well. So that was the basis of my psychological work, was in Dallas. And then later, I was, my wife would have said, this is the most I've talked about myself in years. I was faced with a choice between either going to Syracuse University or a PhD in religious studies and psychology, or moving to Chicago and going to law school. And I didn't have an idea of it then. You're all familiar with Hillman's idea about the daimon in the soul's code, the acorn that's within each of us that has kind of its own destiny that lives through us. One of his favorite quotes is from the poet Auden, who says, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand." Looking back now, as a man who's approaching 70, that choice that I made for law school instead of an academic life, that was the critical moment that made what I do today possible. I really view, and again, Isa, I'm so moved that you heard what I said as a kind of manifesto. I am an advocate for soul. I use all of my lawyerly wiles that I can to, it's the rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of soul. I learned that as a lawyer. The conflict that it's so interesting when I look back at it now. The conflict that I used to have with the partners in the firm I worked in is I would write briefs with images and metaphors. Excuse me just a second. Excuse me one moment. Go away. I'm in a meeting. Go. Okay. My neighbor children just decided to come visit. Sorry. The joys of Zoom. So anyway, what I was going to say is that one of the arguments I used to have is that I believe that images and metaphors and poetic usage are more capable of precision than are the rhetoric of logic and rational thought. So even back then, before I ever had a chance to know it, to me, the choice between the academic study and the more real world, practical step into law, that was a necessary part of my daimon as it has developed over time. I couldn't do what I do today had I not been a lawyer. And it's interesting that I actually stepped away from this work for over a decade because I wasn't ready yet. And I think that's something that can be a great blessing for all of us. You know, there are the geniuses like Hillman who know early on. You know, Hillman tells a beautiful story about the cellist, Jacqueline Dupree, 4 years old, listening to a radio show with her parents. And she hears the cello and says, I want one of those. 4 years old. But that's the exception. Most of us grow into our destinies over the entire course of a life. And this is, again, an instance where it's the people who know us who see the diamond, who see it much more clearly than we do. Our sense of reputation, for example, our reputation belongs to other people. It belongs in the imagination of others. And yet think how fiercely we defend it. Because it's one of those places where, without really realizing it, we understand that we exist more fully within the imagination and hearts of other people. And that fateful decision, not only to go to law school, but to go to law school in Chicago, which has changed my life. And I never would have become a mayor of a small town outside of Chicago had I not made that fateful decision those many years ago. Ben's story.
Benjamin, queria te agradecer pela tua disponibilidade. Eu me lembrei também de uma passagem do Hillman, que ele fala que para se falar de alma, tem que se usar uma linguagem que esteja à altura da alma. E acho que a tua linguagem ela é completamente dotada de alma, metafórica, poética, bonita, agradável, esteticamente bela, alcança o coração. Queria te agradecer a tua presença. Acho que os seus livros têm muito a nos ajudar, somente no momento que a gente vive no país, no Brasil. A gente precisa mesmo de beleza, estamos sedentos de beleza. E queria te agradecer pela tua presença. Muito obrigado por você ter vindo, espero que você tenha gostado. Tá?
Thank you. I just want, I would say in response to that, Marcus, thank you. This has really been one of the first opportunities I've had in a very long time to talk with the group about this kind of work. And I cannot possibly tell you the pleasure that I have looking at this screen and seeing all of your wonderful, welcoming faces, and for letting a visitor from the north come south to see you. I appreciate it.
Queria te agradecer no meu nome, da Luciana Ximenes e da Isa. Tá? Benjamin, deixa eu te fazer uma última pergunta.
Have a great day.
Você é capitão de vela? Você tem um barco? É isso?
A
minha pergunta é se tem beleza no mar. Como é que é a relação do mar com a beleza? Pode ser uma outra palestra também, se você quiser.
I have a book called The Soul of Sailing. So I have a sailing business here. I have a fleet of boats that groups of sailors share, and then I have a sailing school and I teach sailing. But and I don't want to keep you too long, but I will say something about that I think is significant. When I teach people how to sail, I think that I'm doing psychotherapy. Because the great gift of sailing is that it doesn't care about you. It requires you to reconnect with the natural world, to reinvigorate your animal sensibilities. The boat doesn't care about you. You are in service to it, and it only works if you're able to situate it correctly with the natural forces in which you exist. So I personally think that I have accomplished more therapeutically as a sailing teacher than I ever did sitting in a room one-to-one as a therapist. Because the challenge for the modern mind is to re-engage with the world of which we are a part. Sailing requires that. So yeah, there's an enormous amount of beauty and soul in the work. So I thank you for that question.
Eu que te agradeço. Obrigado, Benjamin. Espero que a gente possa nos revermos em breve. Obrigado.
In person next time.
In person. Com certeza. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Mais uma palestra extremamente bonita, um manifesto que pudemos testemunhar e assistir aqui sobre alma e beleza. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Tá? Voltamos no dia, Lu, dia 30, né?
30 de junho com Armando de Oliveira e Silva, Curiosidades Junguianas. Jung em português, um inventário.
Um abraço, bom final de semana belo para todos. Isa, querida. Beijo, Lu. Tchau, tchau. Até lá.